Hey everyone, so this is the video that I mentioned not too long ago about me posting and going over the categories, the general categories theory on globalization. And I'll also talk about the supranational institutions as well as the transnational state. And what I'll do tomorrow is I'll do the Prezi and then I will record it and post it tomorrow evening on the topic of colonization and human rights. And the reason why I connected these two because the first person to actually sort of argue for human rights is a person by the name of Bartolome de las Casas, and he was actually present during Christopher Columbus's voyages in 1492. At first, he was initially supportive of the idea of the colonization process. But then eventually Bartolome de las Casas developed what we could say like a true Christian or Catholic uh, imagination where he actually started questioning a lot of the things that the Spanish did. But I'll go into more detail of that tomorrow. Okay, so then I just want to get through, be able to talk about this. Okay. Even though like a couple of weeks ago I did present like some theories, at least in the Prezi presentation, what I'm going to try to demonstrate is that these three general categories or theoretical categories of globalization, you could actually take the other theories and put those under these categories. Right. And this sort of goes back to the thing that I mentioned the first day or second day that we met, where about being able to think about things in nuanced terms. And nuanced terms just means that we really need to pay attention to the subtle differences between arguments and how these arguments are presented and who makes them and how we're able to categorize them. But hopefully, I'll show you what this looks like in a moment. Okay. So then the three general categories of globalization can be categorized as the hyperglobalists, the skeptics, and the transformationalists. Okay, so first I'll go through the hyperglobalists. All right, and this is actually and I think I mentioned his name before. His name is David Held, and this is a book that I read when I was a graduate student at CSUN when I was studying globalization more formally. Okay. Okay, so then what a hyperglobalist is that what it distinguishes the present era of the past, argue the hyperglobalist, is that the existence of a single global economy transcending and integrating the world's major economic regions. And I'll talk about who OMA is in a little bit. In variously referring to a manic capitalism, turbo capitalism, or superterritorial capitalism, these globalists seek to capture the qualitative shift occurring in the spatial organization and dynamics of a new global capitalist formation. Inscribed in the dynamics of this new global capitalism is, they argue, an irresistible imperative towards the denationalization of strategic economic activities. Today, it is global finance and corporate capital rather than states which exercise decisive influence over the organization, location, and distribution of economic power. Okay, and according to David Held. Okay, so this is basically what David Held is describing. So, hyperglobalists are a group of theorists that believe that globalization is an actual thing, right? Um, and that the moving engine that really moves um, uh, globalization is the idea of capitalism or just the formation of a global economy. Okay, because if you look at the development of economies from a historical lens, and especially if you go back to what happened in Europe in 1648, right, was that there was actually a period in Europe that Europe was fighting each other, or different European countries were fighting each other. And this is called the Treaty of Westphalia, and the Treaty of Westphalia ended that 100 years war, right? That was happening in Europe. So this is sort of like the a very truncated history of that. So then, as I mentioned in class on Wednesday, Europe is the only region in the world that really begins its origin story in a different part of the world, right? And what I mean by that, and this is sort of when we had that brief discussion, that Europe begins its narrative of Europe or Western culture and civilization in the Middle East or going back to Mesopotamia, right? And the reason is because of the Bible, right? Because Europe is considered a Christian, or yeah, a Christian region, and the heavy influence of Christianity or Catholicism at the time. Okay, so then when Rome wasn't existing or in existence, they colonized what we know today as the Middle East. And then you had like the different groups that existed there. You had the Jews, and then you had Gentiles, and all these other different types of ethnic groups. And when Jesus was alive, the Roman Empire was the dominant power, and then the Jewish people were the under Rome's control. Right? And then you had the Pharisees, which were the power elites that were working with the Romans. Right. And then, we know the story of how eventually how Jesus was uh, tried and then convicted and then eventually sentenced to death by crucifixion. Right. And that's sort of what started the the idea of Christianity. Okay. Um, and then when and then once the sorry uh and then in when Constantine was emperor, he actually adopted Christianity, but he sort of used it as a means to um, garner and maintain control, because there was a battle that he was going into, and then he said that he saw a vision in the sky, and that God told him to put a cross on the shields of the Roman soldiers. So then that was the moment where Rome eventually became the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. And Constantine's army actually won that battle. So that gave more legitimacy to the idea of Constantine being able to uh, like see or hear the word of God. Okay. Right. But then once Rome fell, the only institution that really survived the collapse of Rome was the Catholic Church, or what we call the Catholic Church today, right? Like with the Pope and all that. So then for a long time, uh, Europe was dominated by the Catholic Church, right? So the Pope had or was viewed to have more power because he was the go between the human world and being able to communicate to God, right? But then I'm sure you might remember this person by the name of Martin Luther around the 16th century, right? No, sorry, the 15th century, and he sort of um, began to challenge the Catholic Church's power and criticize the Pope and just the power structure of the church, because Martin Luther, when he was a young boy, he was a very devout Catholic, and he became a friar, or like a priest. And one of the things that a young friar had to go do before they could be ordained, if I remember correctly, they had to do a pilgrimage to the Vatican. So then, around 16, 17 years old, Martin Luther was able to collect enough resources to be able to travel to Vatican City for a time. But once he got to Vatican City, he was completely disillusioned with the things that he saw and the things that he heard. I'm pretty sure you heard of the seven deadly sins, lust, sloth, gluttony, envy, greed, and avarice. No, avarice is greed. Sorry, and I forgot the other two. But that's sort of like general idea. Okay. So then, what Martin Luther King, sorry, not Martin Luther King, what Martin Luther saw was that he saw priests that were gluttonous. I mean, because a lot of the priests had to take a vow of poverty. But when he entered Vatican City, he saw all this wealth, and a lot of the cardinals and bishops were wearing gold and jewels, while like the friars like him, they would wear like a brown smock and sandals, right? So there was this huge disparity, and then he just started questioning things, and then especially like for example, like the idea of lust. Um, uh, and not to necessarily say that Martin Luther was prudish, but he did believe in that priests had to maintain a certain level of celibacy, or just maintain celibacy. And when he saw and heard how priests and bishops and cardinals had children, or that they were having affairs with women, that really disillusioned Martin Luther. So then, once he eventually left Vatican City and went back to his, I think it's Heidelberg, Germany, he started writing these letters as a form of protest. And one of the things that he did after he wrote the letters, he would nail them up on the Gutenberg Church, and he would nail the letters on the door. And the most popular thesis, I think, was the 95th thesis, where Martin Luther nailed it to the church door, literally protesting the corruption of the Catholic Church. And that's where we get the word Protestant for Protestant Christians, because they protested the papacy, they protested the corruption and all the things are associated with the practice of Catholicism. So then, and when Martin Luther King, sorry, again, not Martin Luther King, when Martin Luther did this, he was actually afraid and he went into hiding. But then what happened was people started were open to his ideas and wanted to criticize the Catholic Church. So then eventually over time, different kingdoms started adopting more Protestant Christianity versus Catholicism. A case in point, I'm probably sure you heard of Henry VIII, the King of England. And Henry VIII was a very interesting character because he married about like six or seven women. And back then, for a person like Henry VIII had to get permission from the Pope to get divorced. But then, because Henry VIII got tired of his wives, he would kill them, right? And I think the last wife that he killed was Anne Boleyn, and then he wanted to marry his cousin, right? So then, since the Catholic Church didn't give him the divorce, he killed his wife, married his cousin, and then he established the Anglican Church, right? And this was a huge thing because he um, was uh, able to challenge and then establish a state-sponsored religion, right? So that whole thing about Catholicism, or sorry, the Hundred Years' War, sort of was that where um, kingdoms that became Catholic, or sorry, stayed Catholic or adopted Protestantism. That's what was the Hundred Years' War. Right. And then eventually, the fighting between Protestants and Catholic kingdoms literally degraded to the point where Protestant kingdoms were attacking other Protestant kingdoms, and Catholic kingdoms were attacking other Catholic kingdoms. As that 100-year religious war was happening in Europe, there was another war that started and lasted for, if I remember correctly, for another 50 years. And that was the war between Spain and Holland. Because Spain, because of Christopher Columbus, was able to become sort of Europe's first superpower at the time. Um, so then they wanted to control Holland, but then Holland, or the Holland or the Danes, that part of northern Europe, fought against Spanish control because they wanted to maintain their freedom. Okay, so all that stuff was happening. So then eventually, by 1648, okay, the Treaty of Westphalia ended the war, and what it did, it established legally recognized borders between countries. It also helped identify and begin the structure of how countries could develop their own economic system. All right, so this is sort of the beginning or the embryonic period of the development of capitalism, and how a state structure relates to that new system. So then you could see from, and especially during the period of what most historians call the age of discovery or age of exploration, um, or what scholars like me like to say the era of colonization. You saw the development of capital or mercantile capitalism. All right, but then back then it was a closed system, meaning like Spain, England, France, the Dutch, they had their colonies in what we would call, or what the Europeans would call, the New World. But then those specific colonies could not trade with other colonies. Like the French couldn't trade with the English, and the English couldn't trade with the Dutch. So it was a closed system. But this is also the moment where you get the idea of pirates, because pirates sort of were the ones who violated all these rules, where they literally traded with anybody who was willing to trade with them. So they were actually more in line with an open market for trading, compared to the closed system of the colonial, what is known as the metro colonial power relationship, where all the colonists are loyal to the power structure that sent them to the colonies. Okay, so then what happens with globalization, especially in the 19 starting like around the 1970s to the 1990s, you see this consolidation of global capital networks developing, right? And that's sort of the first phase or so excuse me, of global capitalism. And that's why a lot of the researchers would use words like manic capitalism, turbo capitalism, supra territorial capitalism, because each one of these perspectives were actually trying to capture, or sorry, use the terminology to capture what was happening globally in terms of how capitalism was spreading around the world. And as I mentioned, my mentor, William Robinson, he actually developed the theoretical perspective of global capitalism, where he says in his book Global Capitalism, that capitalism has literally touched every corner of the planet, except with a few exceptions, which I mentioned in class on Wednesday, I believe. So that's what hyperglobalists believe, because one of the other arguments that the hyperglobalists say is that the idea of denationalization of strategic economic activities is central to all this. And this is sort of embodied with the supranational institutions for the economy, like the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and the bank Bank Institute, settlements, the BIS. And the BIS is the organization that I mentioned, is that they did a working paper during COVID, and it was their findings and conclusion that in order to maintain capitalism, to make sure that capitalism continues and that we as consumers still are able to consume, they recommended that national governments provide resources or money to their citizens in order to maintain that consumption. Right. So it wasn't necessarily out of the bottom of their heart that certain national governments wanted to give money to their citizens, and I believe I had mentioned that on Wednesday as well. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, right? Because their whole thing is about that globalization is moved by capitalism, like global finance, corporate capital, like Nike, but also banks like City Chase Bank or oh, I can't remember the other one. Oh, but like Bank of America, right? So like this perspective believes that globalization is real and that that's capitalism. Okay, so that's what the hyper globalists believe. Now, the skeptics, on the other hand, they don't necessarily agree that globalization is a thing. That's why they're called the skeptics, right? And I'm trying to remember his name. Oh, Shannon O'Neill. He is a skeptic, right? Because in the section that I have had you read in his book on the globalization myth, he argues that globalization is not the thing, but the thing that's really happening is this idea of regionalism, where you have these economic agreements based on regions. All right, so this is what the skeptic argument is. By comparison, the skeptical position is much more cautious about the revolutionary character of globalization. All right, and Hurst and Thompson are like considered like the first generation skeptics of globalization. Whilst generally recognizing that recent decades have witnessed a considerable intensification of international interdependence, the skeptical interpretation disputes its novelty. By comparison with the Belle Epoch of 1890 to 1914, the intensity of contemporary global interdependence is considerably exaggerated. Moreover, the spatially concentrated nature of actual patterns of economic interdependence suggests that globalization is primarily a phenomenon largely confined to major OECD states. And I'll explain what that is in a moment. In presuming the novelty of the present, so the skeptical position suggests that hyperglobalists ignore the continued primacy of national power and sovereignty. Okay, so then let me sort of like break this down for you. And this is how I'm gonna have you start doing, and especially with the mini seminars, right? So by comparison, the skeptical position is like they don't think, sorry. So the skeptics don't believe that globalization is a revolutionary character, as do the hyperglobalists. Okay. Even though that they do recognize that there isn't an intensification of international trade, they wouldn't necessarily say that is ample evidence to say that it is globalization. Right. And the reason why they say that is because of this. The Belle Epoch is considered like the beautiful epic, right? Of 1890 to 1914. Um, and actually, just to sort of give you a little factoid, Donald Trump last week or 2 weeks ago said in an interview that the United States was at its most richest from 1819 to 1914, right? Um, I'm not sure if you remember this from history class, but this is literally called in the United States the Gilded Age, because the Gilded Age was a moment in U.S. history is where robber barons, right, and robber barons were the billionaires of the late 19th and early 20th century, right, and these are like people like Carnegie, the Rockefellers, um, and I can't remember the other rich family, right? But this is the specific moment in U.S. history, and this is also the moment that Trump said that, as I mentioned earlier, that the United States was its richest because of tariffs. But then what happened was that you had in 1890 a depression, right? And it actually devastated a lot of family farms in the United States. Okay, because for example, I'm not sure if you ever heard of the sociologist by the name of Thorsten Veblen. He was a U.S. sociologist, but his family was originally from Switzerland, I believe, and they emigrated to the United States around the 1850s, 1860s. What happened to him, to his family during the 1890s, was that his family lost their farm, right, when he was a young man, and that, or young boy, and that really soured Veblen against capitalism. So then when went to study at the University of Chicago, he was very critical of capitalism, right? And he wrote a very influential book that you might have heard of, which is called The Leisure Class, where he basically says that conspicuous consumption is just a way for rich people to show off that they're rich. And we could think of Elon Musk, we could think of Donald Trump, right? Like the robber barons of yesteryear. So that was Veblen, and Veblen is considered a non-Marxist Marxist because he's very critical of capitalism and the elite class because of his own history. Okay, all right. So then, and the reason why it ended in 1914 is because that's when World War One started. Because World War One interrupted the development of international trade, and the international trade didn't really start happening until after the Second World War. And that is what allowed the United States to become eventually the economic and military superpower all the way up until the late 20th century, right? So like there's a lot of history I know I'm throwing at you, but all this will all come together, right? So then, but that's sort of the argument, and I sort of mentioned what on Wednesday is because they say that the only difference between what was happening between 1890 and 1914 and what's happening between 1970 to 2025 is the velocity. Because, as I mentioned, you could send packages or money or travel in much shorter time and travel more distance, or the intensity, right? Because we're always being bombarded with information. We're being bombarded with a lot of things through our cell phones, technology. So everything is like there's very little time for a respite to break away from a lot of this overstimulation. All right, and then there is the impact. So since the United States currently is highly is literally an informational economy and a technologized economy, we are very heavily invested into the this network system, right? So then that's sort of like the differences between then and now, because this is also the time period where you had the development of the telegraph, right? So you could literally send a message through telegraph, and it would take a few minutes to send the message from one part of the U.S. or one part of the world to another part of the world. And this is also the time of the railroad system, right? Right after the Civil War in the United States, you had the development of the transcontinental train system, and that's what established the reunification of the United States in terms of like economy and relating the regions of the United States. And this is also the time of mass migration between Europe and what we call the New World or the West, right? Because I'm pretty sure you remember in history class about the Irish leaving Ireland during the potato famine and coming to the United States, or Southern Europeans like Italians, or Eastern Europeans like the Polish. and other people from different parts of the world coming to the United States. Right. So this moment, of the Belle Epoque, is a very critical moment in world history, of because of technology, the changing of societal relations,